Welcome to Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Today we are going Warrior, Episode 2. There's no China in the Bible.
I'm Greta.
And I'm Jamie. Let's get into it.
So much happened in the 19th century that's been essential for making America what it is today.
For making the world what it is today. I mean, really, I think everybody just skipped the 1800s in their studies, and we just thought that in the 1900s, just all of a sudden the world started.
Yeah.
Didn't you have that impression?
Oh, yeah.
The car started in 1894. Everything before that was garbage. Nobody gives a shit.
Well, I mean, I sort of look at the idea of, introducing scientific thinking in the 16th and 17th century, and how that was this essential step from bringing, say, ironworking and chemistry out of this realm of magic and superstition into something systematic that people shared with each other. Because before, you'd figure out how to, say, isolate sulfur, and then you'd keep it a secret and maybe pass it down to 3 people. Right.
Your son and his son and your apprentice. Yeah.
Right. And then it took a long time and for enough people to know how to make sulfur to meet up with somebody who understood about how to make high quality charcoal, and then they finally made gunpowder. People knew about those two things, but not in the same place, and nobody was messing around with it together.
Yeah, there were no encyclopedias to consult. There were no real textbooks to consult. It was real trial and error from start to finish for everybody.
And it was all what everybody was carrying around in their noggin, more or less. And then when they would write stuff down, they'd write it in this weird, heavily coded stuff that turned back into itself, so that now when people read it, they think oh, the secrets of the universe. And it's no, it's just how to isolate sulfur from urine. Calm down.
And I think the best example of that, in my opinion, would you agree, is the Voynich manuscript?
Oh my God!
Yes, the best example of that, which people they watch Ancient Aliens and they suddenly come to the conclusion that aliens suddenly, divulged all this secret information about a secret world to us, and it's
a liquor recipe.
Yeah, and probably they had so much fun making that. But so we are in the, well, we're not in the midst. We're at the beginning of watching the TV show Warrior, which is a phenomenal martial arts Western that was the brainchild of Bruce Lee.
Oh, and I think it just brings in this attractive wildness of the 19th century that we sort of glossed over in all of our history studies. They're 19th century, something, Civil War, something, railroad. Let's move on to the 20th century and World War I. Bye.
Right. And we skip over such things as the beginnings of San Francisco, which are astonishingly cool. What an amazing melting pot that city was.
Yeah, let's pick up where we left off, and this week we know people's names. It's gonna be really cool.
Oh yes, we do. But before we start, because there is slang in this show.
Oh my God, yes! I had so many questions about that for you.
So ask some questions, and I'll see if I can answer them.
Okay, so last week the episode name was The Itchy Onion. There was some familiar slang to me just growing up on the West Coast when they're oh yeah, hey Ching Chong, but you said that there was more slang to that. What was going on there?
Okay, so the main slang that you'll hear in this is duck to describe any white person, and that
right, yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah, that'll be the Chinese immigrants will be calling the white people ducks. And the Chinese people will also be calling each other onions. Now, the reason for this is the makers of Warrior wanted to add slang to the show on the side of the Chinese, but there are no records of Chinese slang in that era because people weren't, there were no sociologists studying the manner in which the Chinese immigrants spoke. So we don't really know what their slang was. And they were all war refugees from China because they were in the midst of all these different rebellions and civil wars and all this crazy strife. So these people came to the shores with different bits of Mandarin, and they were all local dialects, so who knows what they were speaking. Right. But what they did here was they called the white people ducks because a significant portion of the population in San Francisco in that era was Irish, but they were Irish by way of Australia, which is very strange. So they hit the shores of Australia as criminals, got on ships and went to California for the gold rush as criminals, and then started these crazy-ass criminal enterprises. So they had this huge gang called the Sydney Ducks. And the Barbary Coast was originally called Sydney Town because it was so heavily populated by these people, the Sydney Ducks, which was the largest street gang.
God damn.
And so those guys were the ones who originally set up criminal organizations in San Francisco. And then as San Francisco, and I've discovered this about all the different vice cities of the Old West, the way that vice was wiped out was fire.
Okay.
And the Sydney Ducks in particular were big on arson because it was a way for them to achieve their goals in taking over turf and things like that. Except they kept burning down San Francisco over and over again.
Sure.
And so they'd have to rebuild San Francisco by actually dragging, because they had all these old like iron or gold mining ships that were in the harbor that were just laying there disused and they were rotting. So they would drag them out of the ocean and pull them onto Main Street after the city would burn down and build buildings out of these old ships, and that would be the framework for their bar or their tannery or whatever it would happen to be.
Oh yeah, no, I talk a lot about like how important American wood was to sort of European, especially British shipping, and the trees that they were building these boats out of were phenomenal. So yeah, like if you already had cut timber, you're not going to go like cut more timber. That's goddamn hard work.
Yeah. And they had drinking and fighting and gambling and gold mining to do.
Right.
I also, so that's where ducks comes from.
Okay.
The onion comes from the fact that the word for onion in Chinese, and I didn't in both in Mandarin and Cantonese, it sounds like Yong Chong or Young Chong.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where the Ching Chong comes from,
right.
because those people the Chinese immigrants would call each other that. An onion is what it would mean in one, like with the characters, it's a homonym. So the way the characters are set up, the Young Chong means onion in one place or to move west in the other.
Oh,
and so,
okay.
Yeah, so they are Chinese transplants who moved to the west.
To move
Well,
east?
they moved east, but they moved to the west.
Oh,
you know what I
okay,
mean?
okay.
So,
yeah.
because they are the east, they are the Occident, so we are
Got
whatever. What is the opposite of Occident? I learned
No,
it
we
for
are the
1 second.
Occident. They're the Orient.
Oh, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Occident and Orient. Yes,
Yeah, and
there
the
it is.
Orient comes from everybody in like Rome was headed to the Holy Land, which was to their east. So like they sort of thought of the
there
center
you
of
go.
the world as the point like that it was oriented around. It was oriented around the navel of the world, and that even goes back to like Greek mythology and everything. So yeah, the Orient was east, and so the Occident was west.
Oh, well, there we have it. And so there you have the some of the slang origins there.
Yeah, my son took Mandarin, and so I do have a little bit of knowledge. Typically, when you have these homonyms, they're tonally different. So, like some words would like be flat, like maybe yong, and then some would rise at the end, yong, and then other ones would fall down, yong, and all of those have different meanings. My tonal ability is incredibly American, so forgiveness, please.
Right. Mandarin has 4 tones. Cantonese has 7, I think.
Okay.
And then Taiwanese has like 11.
Sure.
Because I didn't understand what the hell I was doing when I was in China, and I also didn't really understand language. I was still beating people with words rather than trying to communicate. So I didn't realize there's a singing aspect to language, to all language, and I completely ignored the tones. So I was a mess trying to speak Chinese. I could, read basic Chinese and write basic Chinese and get myself to and from where I needed to go. But that was about as far as it went.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and, spin our way into episode 2. And yeah, they start this episode with a bang. It is death everywhere.
Oh, that fight scene is badass. Young Jun is such a beast. And I didn't, you don't see it coming when he starts off at the beginning. You think he's just going to kind of be like a little blowhard because he's the boss's son.
Right.
But then he just ends up being this beast with a blade in each hand, just slashing everybody to pieces, and cut that guy's throat with, cut his head off with one slice, and it's just a nasty, nasty fighter. That was a cool fight scene.
Yeah, because, last episode I was like, oh my God, he's just like the cocky little shit. And I'm like, oh, this is why everybody lets him be a cocky little shit. He'll fucking kill them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got that. And then I guess the showrunners are like, hey, what's one deadly sin when you can have two deadly sins? So we go, from death to lust. And in the very next scene, I'm like, okay.
Well, there is a really good aspect. I mean, this show really has, it's full. So it has a subplot for everyone, whether it's whether it's you're following the high level prostitute's machinations as she's trying to establish herself as like a person in the Old West as opposed to just a Chinese person or a woman, both of whom were considered to be less than a white man. Like, she's striving for the top, and so you can root for her, or you can root for any one of these people, which I find really awesome.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I love how, even, typically in these sort of Old West shows that, we all grew up watching, the women were sort of there as these kind of, quasi-sexual accessories. And so normally a scene like that would end and you'd follow the dude out to go do his adventures. And instead you follow her and you just, oh my God, you hear the weight of that silk robe that she puts on. And then she's handling these massive pieces of jade. I'm just like, she is so powerful. That's what you come away with.
I didn't get the message that the jade was conveying. But again, this is such a great way to discuss this show because I'm looking at it and I'm just interpreting all the martial arts and the nationalism expressed through sport and all these different things. And you're looking at the finery that is being displayed, and I love it.
I mean, because, and I also sort of saw it as these two massive displays of power. Like, Young Jun comes in and he is just messing people up, and he didn't just kill them, he destroyifies them.
Yeah, what do you take out, 2 or 3 guys all by himself?
Yeah, and he's just and I'll just take a head off while I'm at it, because
faster than anyone. And then so as he's stabbing the one guy over and over and over who's already clearly dead, and one of his compatriots goes, you could stop, he's already dead, and then he cuts his head off, and it's just like, oh, this man's so hard.
Right. And so that's one way of displaying hard power. And then you run across Mai Ling and she is dripping in power. Another way, it's much softer power. But again, she comes in with the heaviest silk you've seen in this entire show. And, these pieces of jade the size of her hand. These are some bad asses to watch out for. And it how it expressed in 2 different ways.
And because you mentioned that, the way you mentioned that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is Bruce Lee's vision, because he was always talking about combining the hard and the soft, which we got exactly as you just said it in that scene. It is yin and yang. It's being like water. It is perfect. This show is amazing.
Yeah, and, one thing, I'm watching this show, and there's been this whole trend in media recently where it's we don't want you to guess what's going to happen or when somebody's going to die. And I am really super over that. I've never really enjoyed it. I much more appreciate good writing that takes you where you're supposed to go and you can kind of see how it happens. And I think they're really doing that well here. So, we'll see how it all goes down in the end. But, I like the way that this is writing. They're sort of laying down all of these pathways, and it's not real clear. It's we were talking about Richard, the police officer who we'll talk about in a second. You kind of know what's going to happen to him, but I'm I want to see how we get there. What all of the intricacies of everybody's characters are that gets them to the places where we kind of know where they're going to go. And I love all the backstory here.
Absolutely. You know, in that way, it's reminiscent of Halo to me.
Okay.
The Halo TV show. When I thought that I had, you thought, oh, well, this is where it's going to go. And then it immediately pivots. And you're like, well, I didn't expect that, but that's even better than I thought it was going to be, you know?
Right.
So, and this show always does that. It always delivers more than you expect.
Yeah. And so, speaking of Richard Lee, jawline from Georgia.
Oh, what did you call him? What did you call him? The show's most beautiful man?
Yes. But also the baby.
The most beautiful face in the show.
I may just start talking about him as the jawline from Georgia.
Okay.
But yeah, so he shows up at Bill O'Hara's house and oh my God. Last week you were saying like, okay, he's making this a bodice ripper, and Mrs. O'Hara opens the door and she's like, so what does your wife think about this fan?
Oh yeah. She's about to pass out. Yeah. And then he says, oh, well, I don't have a wife. And she almost died. She was like, whoa, and her husband pulled him away like, that's enough. You can shut up now. Go deal with our 85 children.
The way this is written, and also the way the actress that plays Mrs. O'Hara, she's like, I'm gonna go big with this, and it was, and she's holding the snotty whiny baby. It was, I really enjoyed the hell out of that.
Yeah, and again, showing the depiction of what an Irish household was like for a policeman on the take versus. Mm-hmm. The mob boss or, the regular worker. It was just the show really gives a great overview of how life was at the time, albeit without the endless amounts of mud and the dysentery and the smoke.
Yeah, but I really love the number of interiors we've already seen. Like, I'm like, okay, they've got some money because,
Oh, so many exposed wood beams. I love them so much.
Yeah, but I mean, so this this middle-class household was like a new interior, and I'm like, this is spectacular, but we've also seen the brothel, we've seen the Hop Way meeting room, we've seen... Oh, we're going to see City Hall. No,
we have seen City Hall already, yeah.
Yeah.
We see the inside of a jail, which...
Yep.
Yeah. And that was another thing, and I thought it was dead on, at least to my experience, when I was in back alleys in Beijing. When he cuts through the back alleys in the first episode, that was my experience. It is a labyrinth. You have no idea where the hell you're going.
Oh, totally.
It's terrifying. It's dark as shit, and like... Everything's in an odd angle. There in those old buildings, nothing was like plumb and level. So it was all like shifted and weird, and yeah, it really conveyed that well.
Oh yeah. So okay, we get to spend a little time looking at, period grooming, how makeup kind of worked, which I thought was a lot of fun. Because, yeah, oh my God, Atoy is so mad at her little protected, one of her creatures turns out to be working for the other side, and she has to be punished.
Oh, and you know what? They didn't show exactly what the punishment was on that.
Oh, you don't know what happened to her?
Well, they showed the scissors.
Yep.
I assume, did they clip her nose or something? Or
no, you said you'll still be pretty. They cut her tongue out.
That was going to be my second guess. So yeah. So she let rival gang members into her brothel, and that was her punishment, was to have her tongue cut out, because then she'd still be an earner for her boss.
Right, and that works because that was a really typical punishment for women who talked out of turn. I know it was in the West, it was in the East. It would happen to a lot of women.
Almighty.
Yeah, in like having your tongue.
If I did take a time machine to the past, I would just be beating the shit out of people from the beginning to the end. I don't think I'd do anything else.
Yeah, no, this was always a threatened punishment for women who were too troublesome, whether they were the concubines of highly placed men or they were just annoying, women on the street. Because making a woman unattractive, that was seen as a terrible thing to do to society. Not necessarily to her, but to society.
Oh, but making them silent is God's work.
Well, yeah, exactly, yeah.
The baby Jesus is very pleased with a silent woman.
So, yeah.
He shakes his chubby fist at you. Shut up!
So just I'm like, all right, a little more like blood flying around. Let's move on. So yeah. So we've got Richard Lee and Bill O'Hara, and they're like, okay, why are we going to the Irish Quarter? We're supposed to be doing Chinatown, and those super messed up guys from the show Open are lying there on the ground.
Yeah, the guys that young June tore to pieces.
Yeah, and oh my God, Richard Lee goes Hercule Poirot on them. And he's like in there, like checking the depth of cuts. He's got his notebook out.
Oh yeah, and that was the time for it, because Sherlock Holmes was Sherlock Holmes out at that point?
Yeah.
No, that was just before. Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, Sherlock Holmes, for people who don't know, the fictional character Sherlock Holmes is the one who invented modern actual police work. Like, it didn't exist before him. So his character, Lee, is really like living up to kind of the ideal of his mentor there, which I really enjoyed, because the police work of that era was really shitty.
Oh yeah, no, it was basically the people in power hired these thugs to keep people under control, and you arrested and threw into jail the people who you were told to arrest and throw into jail. I mean, you might actually catch somebody in the act and do something about it. But other than that, it was really like, all right, well, like in Gangs of New York, when Boss Tweed,
let's have a hanging.
And he's like, go find like 4 dudes. I don't know.
Yeah, you would actually pay the police to get your goods back if you'd go to them and say, my such and thus was stolen. If they tracked the person down and got it back for you, you paid the cop for your goods back.
Yeah.
So it was a different deal. But that's where we see Kieran Bew again, Big Bill O'Hara, who is my pick for the hottest dude in this show. Okay. And he is he's basically the Bill the Butcher of this show.
Yeah.
His name is even Bill. He is the guy, except he's Irish, but he's the guy who settles things. He's the guy that you go to, and he seems like a very reasonable man, and he seems irritated, like he's a reluctant leader, which personally is my favorite kind of leader.
Right, yeah, and he's like, okay, this is kind of the way the world that I'm living in is set up, so everybody just follow the rules, everyone will get along fine, stop being, junior super inspector dude, Richard Lee, like, calm down, just calm down.
Yeah, and it's a really great counterpoint, because the Irish guy is the racist, and he's the guy you would expect to be, because being an immigrant himself, would be more kind to other immigrants, whereas the Southerner, who do you expect to be the virulent racist, is the one who is the most racially tolerant of the bunch.
Right, and it definitely gets down to that, Ted Lassoism, all people are different people. And yeah, everybody gets a backstory, and I'm digging it. So, speaking of backstories, we get to see Penelope Blake walking the streets, and she's not walking alone, because she's too
The mayor's wife, let's just clarify.
Yeah, Mayor Blake, Mayor Samuel Blake.
She isn't just walking the streets. She is going with her Chinese valet to get laudanum, or opium, from a Chinese pharmacist. And the Chinese pharmacist is going, that tiny little lady is taking way too much fucking opium.
Yeah. And it's important to note that, Penelope, nice white lady, is not going into the Chinese store. Her Chinese servant, who she calls Jacob, he's the one who's actually doing the work.
Yes. And, well, I mean, that's what a valet does.
Yeah,
But yeah, so she's waiting outside, and then she is accosted by a couple of angry Irishmen who are drunk and outside of a bar, which is how a lot of people were at that point, because I learned yesterday that the Great Depression of 1929 began in 1873. Did you know that?
I did not. No.
It was called the Long Depression, and it was horrific. Apparently, like, it just kept getting, like, every time that they'd see a little light at the end of the tunnel, it would go to shit again. They'd have another bank failure.
Yeah, no, there's a whole monetary crisis. Yeah, there's a billion things wrong. But an important thing here is that at this point, last week you said a little bit about like, yeah, women could make their fortune, and that was like one of the few places that they could have power, which is all true. But it also meant that if you saw a woman walking around without her father or her husband with her, or like a large family around her, you pretty much probably assumed she was a prostitute of some sort, and therefore open for being accosted without consequence.
Yes, and so she is accosted, and her Chinese valet is the one Chinese guy in this entire show who doesn't know kung fu and gets his head kicked in, and then Assam comes to the rescue with some dope high-flying spinning kicks, which again, I would say are probably Mijong for anybody who is paying attention at home. Oh, and I did want to clarify, I said Mijong was the style, kind of the style of Bruce Lee. I didn't mean it as Jeet Kune Do was Mijong. I meant that Bruce Lee is basically a Chinese folk hero in the same way that Chen Zhen was, who was Huo Yuanjia's disciple. They're both like guys who were in Once Upon a Time in China and Fist of Legend, but these are people who were like instrumental in the foundational mythology of Chinese martial arts, and they all incorporated Western martial arts with Eastern martial arts in order to defeat Western fighters, like the quote-unquote superior Western fighters, because they were showing that the quote-unquote sick man of China wasn't so sick. So that I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody wanted to get at us in the comments about it.
No, and super duper like hats off to the fight coordinator, because they're actually using fighting styles of the individual characters to elucidate their character traits. And so
their personality, everything showed that everybody fights differently.
Yeah, and so Assam in the cold open, and then here, like he's using more like policeman moves, like calm down, dude. Be cool. You know, like where he pops the guy on the side of the head and everything. Like he's not trying to.
Yeah, he open-handed slaps that guy. Yeah,
right. Like
he's like, you're drunk. Take it on down the street.
Right,
it's not.
right.
He's not trying to cut these guys' heads off.
And
he had a hatchet on him, so he could have easily killed the guys.
Yeah, and so Assam's personality is so coming out in the way he's approaching this, and also that he is a delicate, sweet baby here to rescue people. He doesn't want to hurt anyone, and so after like he lays out these Irish drugs, he goes down to like tenderly lift Penelope up from the ground. And
he was chasing her for the dumbest, most ridiculously unnecessarily chivalrous reason.
Hot damn.
They had bumped into each other in a shop while Assam was shaking down the shop. Oh, in the pharmacy. They were shaking down the pharmacist, and she stepped in to intervene and then dropped her glove. So he was like a gentleman going to return her glove to her when she was accosted, and then he saved her.
Yeah, but so what happens to him when he goes down to tenderly lift Penelope Blake up from the pavement?
He is clubbed over the head by a racist Irish cop.
Oh my God, when that happened, I'm like, oh, you precious baby. Oh my God. You don't understand the rules at all, do you?
Yeah, so they later say that he was in the pond, which is they're saying that he was in the pond with the other ducks, which the other white people, which is anything outside of Chinatown.
Right, yeah.
And so as it turns out, Chinatown was part of the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast was that entire area. But so Chinatown was basically, I looked up maps of it because I was curious. And there were actually like very detailed maps of all of the different criminal activities that went on in each building. It was wild. Yeah, they had very specific delineations in territory, and you were not to cross, especially if you were Chinese, you were not to go and do anything untoward in the white section of town, or else the cops were going to come and club you over the head no matter what you were doing, even if you were saving a white lady from distress.
Yeah. In fact, I feel like that scene was so well written because when I sort of went back, and what really well directed too. When I went back and rewatched it just to like get it all together, there was a moment where like he sees the cops kind of coming, and if he knew what was what, Assam would have just like turned on his heel and just booked it out of there. And he doesn't. And then he gets clocked on the back of the head by Bill O'Hara, and I'm like, you idiot.
Yep, and then you're the jaw. What did you call him? The jawline from the South.
The Georgia,
the Georgia jawline.
The Georgia
jawline.
The
Georgia jawline steps in and tries to white knight it for Assam, but it does not go his way, and he ends up in jail as John Chinaman because he refuses to speak English to the white people who were railroading him into jail.
Yeah, and that John Chinaman is that is something you see all over the records during that time period. The number of men who are signed up to work for the railroad as John Chinaman or like Bob Chinaman are legion. Like that was just...
Was that common in where you live as well, in San Francisco or in Seattle? Because you have a significant Asian population up there as well, right?
Right. I think, and so
Vancouver.
that was definitely a term that was used. By the time it's the 1980s, a lot of that particular thing has definitely calmed down. But if you look at the historical records, you will see people named John Chinaman or just that was a good historical detail right there, and something that happened. And so when people who are not, nativist Americans are going back and trying to like trace people, it's often obscured by, these, you won't tell us a name or I can't understand that gibberish and I'll just write down something like that.
Yeah. And, I have to admit that I was surprised when I saw this show because right after I wrote, I did a little like a Instagram post once about, and I can't recall the woman's name off the top of my head. She even ended up in my book Bite Size History, but it was about she helped desegregate San Francisco's streetcars before the Civil War. So their streetcars were integrated, and I expected to see like they were totally racially integrated because she was mixed race. And so anyway, so I expected much more integration and much less division. I think when I saw the show, I was really surprised by how strictly defined it was, especially since there were everybody was just piled in there, and it's like it would be like a kid picking like getting a bowl of stew and then just getting like 10 different ramekins and picking out all the different foods from the stew and putting them in their ramekins and then trying to eat it like that. It just doesn't, you know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense, but that's what it was.
It totally makes sense what you're saying. I think a lot of the racial segregation that we're seeing and the class segregation that we're seeing is intensified by the fact there's a lot of money in San Francisco. And this story is also dealing with people in positions of power, whether they're in positions of power at the Tong or in the American government. I think when you got down to the lower classes, there was a lot more sort of like mixing and, sloshing side to side. But when you're at the tippy top of power, we see Buckley, glasses guy, who I couldn't remember from last time, and Mylene, they're like, no, these divisions help us. We are thriving off of the chaos that's created when we push these divisions.
Yeah, and people are broke because they're slow walking this railroad, and it's even hurting the rich people by slow walking the railroad. But somehow it benefits the government a bit through graft, and it's it does really show that unchecked free market capitalism doesn't seem to be beneficial for anyone.
Yeah. I was really super curious. Well, so a couple things happened. So poor Assam ends up in jail, and he gets subject to, delousing with the sulfur powder and something else.
Oh, that looked brutal. I mean, you see it in movies periodically, and every time they show it, it just looks awful.
And then that high pressure hose that they were using on him,
yeah, I mean, it was just like the Rambo. I expected Brian Dennehy to kick in a door and join in the fun with a wire brush or something.
But what was interesting to me about that is that sort of high pressure water technology. You're like, well, like they didn't have electric pumps, so how is this happening? And that sort of like high, or they did, but they wouldn't have been in a jail. But that sort of higher pressure water technology had come out of the railroads and mining. And so since San Francisco, had both of those things, they'd have these water systems in place and these high pressure hoses. The female secretary who's working in City Hall, I was like, yep, this is San Francisco. You don't have enough dudes who can read. So you get some women who have like these positions in the halls of power. If this had been in New York or Chicago, that would have been a dude working the secretary desk.
Oh, really?
Because you just don't have, it's once again, anytime you have a labor shortage.
Well, I think honestly, in real life, they would have had a man working there too. There weren't enough women, and the women.
Not necessarily.
You think?
Yeah, because remember, you're starting to get this upper class. You have, these educated women. You have women who are spinsters.
Oh, and they want jobs.
Yeah, and you just don't have enough guys who are well educated to take on, because that's a highly literate position that she's occupying. And so I'm saying in San Francisco, you would have women who would be secretaries.
Yeah, they weren't really. Well, there was an intelligentsia. Mm-hmm. It's not really. They don't really go into the social scene at this point in San Francisco, but there was a significant.
Oh, sure.
Even though the theater was like this psychotic burlesque, very similar to Gangs of New York, the theater goers were often well educated, and at least some of them.
Oh yeah,
and the people performing were often very well educated. So there was like an intellectual locus in San Francisco, which at some point I wrote about, and I can go into at some point. But but yeah, it really was. This was a lot of very crazy people who spent a lot of time underground. I watched a documentary on the Barbary Coast yesterday, and they to do the gold mining, they built these intertwining series of tunnels all through this one vein. So they were like, it was like an ant's nest basically. And then one day the whole thing just collapsed, and so then they dug it all out and did, and I'm sure a ton of people died. And then they dug it all out and made this open pit mine. But by the time this show hit, that had all dried up, and the recession had kicked in. So these were desperate, stupid, crazy people who had a lot of exposure to explosives and like weapons. So yeah, I would say you're probably right. Now that I think of it, maybe women would be preferable to a man who was used to being down in a tiny little coffin mine shaft.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, there was sort of like different sorts of labor shortages in San Francisco, and so having a woman working sort of this lower level secretary position, completely plausible for San Francisco at this age, and the fact that they did it. Yeah, you were talking about the cable car and how they were like slow walking, rolling out the cable car, and the way I was reading that is like, at first I thought it was the mayor Samuel Blake who was slow walking it, but then we find out that it's Buckley who's slow walking it, and I'm like,
who's got his own agenda. Which, so now there's yet another agenda laid atop the other agendas.
Yeah, and so you sort of see that, like, okay, so Byron Mercer is the father of Penelope Blake. And so he, clearly rich dude, more or less exchanged his daughter with and married her to the mayor, which we can already tell is an incredibly terrible marriage.
Yeah, and she's probably an opium addict specifically because she was married off into this horrible marriage for her father's sake.
Right, and now Buckley's slow walking it, and just having watched, a bunch of these, my thought is that Buckley wants to somehow bankrupt or make Mercer really super desperate. So he's getting all of the material, the rails and so on, for like pennies on the dollar. Like, he's going to have to sell them at these like desperation prices. But then also clearly there's this thing going on with O'Leary, where, he's going to provide the workers for the cable car line. So I'm like, oh, I am loving all of these beginnings of stories that they're setting up. Like, they're just lighting fuses everywhere.
Exactly. And you're like, and at this point in the second show in, you're like, I don't care if it's O'Hara or Assam. One of them needs to cut Buckley's head off before the end of season 1.
Yeah, no, he is like the Weasley, and like he and Mai Ling.
He is so perfectly cast.
Yeah,
my
they
God.
are both in there, just like spiking everybody's hopes and plans to make San Francisco a better place.
Make San Francisco great again.
No, not make San Francisco great again. Long Zi and Father Jun as the head of the Teutons, they're like, dudes, we need peace. And so, like, they're trying to do that. They're trying to make San Francisco a better place. I'm like, the TED Talkification.
Yes. I was referring to the Buckley and the Mayor's crew. They're really sort of on the.
Yeah. No, Buckley and Mai Ling are definitely the like, no, chaos is our friend. Let's screw everybody's plans for making it a better place. Because there's no money in that.
Yeah, and the Tongs definitely are. I mean, they formed out of like social societies that were trying to improve the lives of the Chinese immigrants there. So they're still working for those social goals, and you can see it in their actions. I mean, even down to when the Hatchet Men are fighting certain people, they don't, like Assam, he open-handed slapped people rather than just killing people outright.
Right. So there was one detail about Assam that I wanted to talk about, and it sort of gives like this little window into his backstory, and I'm guessing you might have some familiarity with it. So when Assam says, okay, I have an American grandfather, that tells me that Assam's family and his sister Xiaoxing, who became Mei Ling, they were clearly part of probably a pretty low-class family. If they had an American ancestor, they were part not Chinese. And so that's going to make you like an alien in China.
But this was a period of like French and English intervention in China because all the revolutions and everything, and they were trying to get opium out of China. So there were a lot of Westerners, especially in the coastal cities. I haven't really.
Oh, hell yeah!
I haven't really studied the interracial children of but I mean there were children of missionaries and things like that. But so the Qing were more open because they were allied with the West, so they were open to the West. And then on the other side, the Taiping Rebellion guys and anybody allied with them hated Westerners, so they just kill them on sight.
Even the Qing, they were like more open to doing business with Westerners, but still, if you were a mixed race kid in China, your life sucked.
I think life in China sucked for every single person who lived there at this point. I mean, except for maybe wealthy Qing noble women, because they didn't have their feet horribly snapped up and broken like the ethnic Han Chinese. But that's about the only people who were winning in China at that time.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, but it did make sense to me that like, okay, so Assam and Xiaoxing come from this like lower class family. Clearly she was sold into marriage or concubinage to this Sun Yang guy that she left in China to save Assam's ass back there. I'm like, okay, these like puzzle pieces are coming together. It's kind of fuzzy how they are, but they do kind of make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked kind of that backstory. Yeah, this was definitely a fuse lighting episode. 1,000 things are set up to go terribly, terribly wrong. You've got a fight over the opium shipments. They keep calling it molasses because it's like this dark, sticky substance. You've got Buckley and Penelope's dad kind of at loggerheads. You can kind of see that Mayor Blake is not as in charge as he thinks he is. Because then he's got like O'Leary and O'Hara under him, like there's like, he's sort of sitting atop of San Francisco. I'm the mayor and I'm the most powerful man. Like, oh my God, dude, you're in trouble. So yeah, I like where this is going, but oh my God, I am not a fan of the sloshing noises during the sword fights.
Oh, that's why my wife will not watch most like action and horror movies with me. The squish is just, she's like, nope, that's it for me. I will see you later. No squishing for me, thank you. You know how they make those noises?
Not specifically.
They stick their hand into watermelon and squish their hand around.
Yeah, I mean, Foley work is so much fun. The things that they do to produce different sound effects, I think, is great. So I like where we are. I like kind of how we're about to sort of take off. Oh, the one thing that made me laugh in terms of story structure, you know how things happen in movies where you're like, oh my God, why did they do that? So the story could happen. Penelope would never have had her gloves off when she dropped one. She's outdoors and she's on an errand. Like
she dropped one so that he would pick it up and bring it to her. Duh.
I know, and I was just laughing. I was like, so this story could happen. But I'm like, realistically, she would have had those gloves on.
At some point, we will have to go into there were these books of social etiquette that were going around. And let's remember that at the time, people were not terribly literate. So these were very specific rich people reading these books. And in these books, they would have all these popular books about different ways you could tell a guy that you liked him by, what was it, dropping your kerchief or something along those lines.
Drop your handkerchief.
And the way you dropped it and all these, and they had all these elaborate meanings, except no man ever bought one of those books. And so it was just women dropping their shit all over the place and guys being like, these women, Jesus, hold on to your shit. Like, is there a hole in your purse?
Yeah, and there was also like a whole fan language, how women...
That's what, there was the fan language. I was listening to a BBC show about it, and like, men had no idea what these women were doing, and the women thought that they were conveying these very specific things, when in fact all it was if you made any eye contact with a man, he was going to rape you. So that's how it worked.
Yeah.
You make eye contact, then rape.
Yeah. They were definitely working from two entirely separate scripts.
Yeah. They're through a haze of cocaine and hard liquor. And this lady who was forced to be sober, mind you, and fanning herself because she's wearing 800 layers of clothing and it's 90 degrees outside. Yeah.
No, that is one of the interesting things about America is you had all of these people coming from, all of these different cultures that had, different etiquette and different sort of tribal rules for how to act. And then a lot of the social markers for like, are you rich, are you poor, had disappeared. In the 18th century, like all these people were coming from Europe. If you ate meat, you were high class, but there was meat everywhere in America. So
yeah, in America, there was meat everywhere.
That's no longer a social marker. And also in the 18th century, other than just like a few pieces of clothing that were imported from Europe, like everybody's kind of wearing like rough homespun, rich or poor, for the most part, and like buckskin breeches. Your clothes aren't necessarily that much of a marker. And so they do start instituting like all of these fancy, like, how do you drink your tea? How do you hold your teacup? You know how to use a fork, because forks were there, but they were like super new. The way you cut your meat. They started erecting all of these social barriers so you could more easily spot somebody who was of your class.
I know that, so the color lavender was originally one of those colors, and this was around the time that we started to see the democratization of fashion because artificial lavender was created when a scientist was trying to create a cure for malaria. But and he ended up creating a bunch of artificial scents and colors, but never did create a cure for malaria, and ended up really, really hating the fashion industry when he died. But he single-handedly democratized fashion. I haven't noticed any lavender in this show yet, but I don't think I've really been looking.
There probably wouldn't have been a lot of purple and lavender because, it was every the fuck where in Victorian England. Like, every color of purple was all over Victorian fashion. But again, in 1878, in order to get stuff from where the artificial dye is going to be like over the Atlantic Ocean. Then it's going to have to come all the way across the continental U.S. because we've got the Transcontinental Railroad, or it's going to be like sailed all the way around. So we might see some of it coming up later.
Gotcha.
But for the most part, you actually have more Chinese dyes on the West Coast because it's closer. And then you have natural dyes. The amount of silk people are going to have in San Francisco is actually going to be as high or higher than, definitely higher than somewhere like Chicago, but, similar to New York just because it's like right there. And these steamer captains who are bringing over the Chinese immigrants, they're getting a cut from that. But they might as well bring some like silk and tea because that's light and cheap and shelf stable. So,
nice.
They're making some bucks that way too.
So I guess we should probably wrap it up. But before I forget. I love doing like a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon type thing. And I was trying to connect Bruce Lee to this show a little more, and I managed to figure it out. So, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was behind the foundation of the Republic of China and then the Republic of Taiwan, he lost the Chinese Civil War to Mao Zedong. Mm-hmm. He spent some time in San Francisco and was living with one of the Tongs there, one of the two major Tongs.
No.
Yes, when he went back to China, then he went to Japan and he, so he went to Japan and he became the sponsor of Wong Fei Hung, who I mentioned earlier, is a Chinese martial arts folk hero. He founded this school called the Qinwu Athletic Association.
Okay.
And it was like the major way for China to assert itself, because at the time, every nation was trying to assert its own nationalism through sport. And martial arts was a way for them to do this. So the Japanese were taking karate from the Okinawans and calling it Japanese, and the Chinese had this. And so the Jinwu Athletic Association was Bruce Lee played that character in Chinese Connection.
Oh.
Of Huo Yuanjia. And then if you've seen Fist of Legend, Jet Li plays his disciple's character in Fist of Legend.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is this really, it all comes together. Like I swear, we could teach anything to anybody with fashion, lifting, martial arts, and food. It's amazing. It's so much fun.
Yeah, and of course, the other shortcut is that Bruce Lee's daughter, Shannon Lee, is one of the EPs, the executive producers for the show. So there's that too.
Oh, I didn't even realize that. That's very cool. She's a very accomplished martial artist in her own way.
Oh, heck yeah. So,
yeah.
All right. Tell us about your cool 19th century focus. Well, not 19th century entirely, but your physical culture excitement that you work on the rest of the time.
Well, I had that my 30 for 30 on ESPN debuted last week. That had nothing to do with the 19th century, but I was the historian for an episode about American gladiators. And currently I have a bunch of stuff on sale on Amazon, books on sale on Amazon and on my website, plagueofstrength.com. How about you?
The rest of my media time is spent doing the history of American food. I just finished up the 18th century, running up to the American Revolution. And so I can sort of see the 19th century from where I am. And so, yeah, when you sort of propose this project, I'm like, yeah, the 19th century is madness. And so I'm looking forward to covering it from just a food aspect, but I love covering it here with you too.
At some point, we'll have to do just a sidebar episode and talk about San Francisco street food in the 19th century. I bet the street food had to have been so much fun. And it would be fun to find out what Assam might have been snacking on before he was going to go kick some ass. You know what I mean? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll have to do, the gold mining and just sort of like what's the understory to this story that's being told in Warrior. And just, spin out some of the attractive wildness that is 19th century San Francisco.
Yes. And before we close, when I was painting that picture of the Warren of Mines in San Francisco, you'll have to look them up to really get a clear view of it. But I'm talking about wormholes. These are holes that a man could lay flat in and crawl forward in. You couldn't stand up. You couldn't kneel. They would just crawl forward, put a little dynamite, crawl backwards, blast. Crawl forward, blast. It was what a claustrophobic, psychotic nightmare. And then when they started collapsing in on each other, because they were just crisscrossing all of these different tunnels that had no supports in them, that were only big enough for a man to barely crawl. I mean, God, these people must have been pants-shittingly crazy, on top of the dysentery making them shit their pants off.
Literally and figuratively.
Yes.
Oh, God. Yeah. Or working to live, but it's going to kill you, I guess. All right. Well.
Yeah. Well, you know what? There's a great quote from that in this episode.
Yes.
Young Jun.
Wang Chao. Yeah.
He said.
Wang Chao
says America is not a place to live a long time or to live to old age.
He said, "Live fast, die rich." Yeah.
Yeah, live fast, die rich. There it is. Yeah. So there it is. There's our closing line. Live fast, die rich.
Yeah, it's true.
In America, I mean, we don't have health insurance, so we got to do something.
Okay. So, so next time we'll be back for episode 3. And yeah, we'll start getting out some bonus episodes on all of this 19th century madness.
Woohoo!
All right. Talk to you later.
See you next time.
Now that you've listened to a couple of episodes, go ahead, subscribe, and hey, leave a quick review on your favorite podcast widget. It helps. You can find more of Jamie and how he can make you stronger at plagueofstrength.com. You can learn more about old American food on my other podcast, The History of American Food. We're on Instagram at PCG Podcast, and you can always reach out to us by email at pcgpodcasters@gmail.com. And you can find more dope beats like this one from royalraven.com.